Hello, welcome to today's Info Security webinar. My name is Michael Hill, Deputy Editor, and I'll be taking this session, which is in association with Veracode. So for the next hour, we're going to be looking at the trials and tribulations of component security. Are organisations at risk? So we're going to explore how organisations can best take on open source risk and elaborate on findings from a recently published Vanson Bourne study. So before I introduce our panel of speakers, I'll just run through a few quick housekeeping points on my end. There's going to be 3 poll questions throughout the session today, so please do vote on those. I'll announce when they're going live, and we're keen to get your thoughts on those. Also, there's a questions option that you can use. You can let us know of any questions you have, and you can note on there if any questions are for a particular speaker, and we'll do our best to answer those questions for you later in the session. Also, for those of you on Twitter, our hashtag is InfoSecWebinar, so do feel free to join the discussion on social media as well. Just a quick note too about credits for this session. Attending this session for 50, that's 50 minutes, does qualify you to 1 credit. Once you've done that, you can download your certificate from your Info Security account and submit it, and there are further instructions on the download section on the website for doing that. Please note the certificates will be processed overnight and made available to download the following day. To get us started then, I'll just introduce our speakers for this session. There's myself, Michael Hill, Deputy Editor. We have James Jardine, who's CEO of Jardine Software. Callum Budd, who's Project Manager at Vanson Bourne. And Mark Kirkby, who's Founder and CEO at SourceClear. So just before I hand over to our first speaker then, I'll start the voting on the first poll question. So firstly, we want to know which of the following best describes your role. Is that A, security, B, development, C, operations, D, other management? And I'm going to start the voting on that one now. So that'll be going live, so please do vote on that one. And we'll come back to those, that answer a little bit later on. But moving on, delighted to introduce our first speaker today, James Jardine. So James, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Michael. I appreciate you inviting me to join this panel, and I look forward to talking a little bit about component security that we're looking for today. So for everybody out there, we're talking about component security, and we want to understand, identify if we have insecure components in our software. And one of the things I'm going to discuss is talking about how software is comprised of so many different levels of components and how each of those can actually be a source of vulnerability. So we're going to talk a couple examples of vulnerabilities or issues we've seen with some components. We're going to look at how components fit into our application, and then we're going to deep dive into each one of those types of components real quick to talk about what they are so you can start to identify those. So the first thing I want to talk about, left pad. And I don't know, 2016, maybe some of you have heard about this or not. Doesn't make a lot of sense just sitting on a screen, but 2016, there was actually an issue with the NPM package manager, not the manager itself, but somebody had created a function. It was called left pad, and all it did was it would take in a string and it would allow you to pad to the left to make the string a certain number of characters. Well, the deal is that this function or this package was actually embedded in all kinds of software and other packages and other NPM packages. So all kinds of applications were actually using this function. They might not have even been using it, but they were using packages that use this, right? There's multiple layers to these functions and these components. And it ended up, the developer of this, due to some other issues, ended up pulling their package. And this broke, one could say, the internet of sorts. This was a huge problem. It broke React. It broke a lot of main components that people use because it relied on this other component. So it's a good example, not necessarily maybe security related, although it's a denial of service. If your stuff goes down, this was able to go in and cause a huge issue because of our reliance on our third-party packages. Now, the other thing probably more people have heard about, Equifax getting breached earlier this year. This was a big issue. The talk of it was an Apache Struts patch that was missing, a vulnerability there that just didn't get patched in time, leading to a compromise. And this was really big news and another good example of where we see the potential for, if you've got vulnerable components, this is what can happen. This is probably on the excessive side a little bit based on the organization that it was, but this is something that we need to be concerned about as end users and as organizations developing our software. So when we talk about the components in our software. I tried to put together a quick little diagram here, right? There's lots of components for when I build an application, whether it's a web application, a mobile application, to put this out there for somebody to use, right? We have the operating system, that underlying piece that's going to support us. Now, fortunately, that's usually patched separately. We really don't think a lot about that from our application standpoint. Then we also have the web server that's there. So if you're using IIS, if you're using Apache, Nginx, whatever that may be, that's another component that we have in our application, again, usually patched by infrastructure or some operations group to kind of maintain that. And sometimes those are done through operating system level patches. Then we have our framework sitting on top of that. So whether we're using .NET or something like that, we'll talk a little bit about frameworks. Then we have our code, and we have components on the server side. And then we have, over on the other side, we have the client-side components that make everything look nice and pretty and work smooth within our browser. And then we got the little box of our custom code, because we're trying to make applications really quick. So obviously, we're relying on a lot of components to do a lot of this heavy lifting for us. So the actual custom code our internal team is writing is often not nearly as big as it used to be, because a lot of these functions are brought in through these other components. So let's talk real briefly about the framework. So that's kind of that higher level that we think about within our application. So whether you're running Node.js or ASP.NET, PHP, Rails, all these are the big major frameworks, and they provide so much for us within our application, but they're kind of a whole piece, right? It's a complete package that has a lot of stuff just built into it. We deploy that, and we say, okay, I'm going to build on this platform. And patches come out for those, so obviously we need to make sure that we're keeping those patched as we're going through. Kind of a subset of these are our CMSs, like WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, all these different CMS systems that are made available to us that we also need to make sure that we're keeping patched, keeping up to date. But that's kind of a whole system approach. It's not one off, two off, really. That's our bigger picture. Well, the next thing we're going to look at is then we got those server components, right? We're not going to really talk about our custom code here, but on the server side, we have all these different components. So if you're a .NET person, right, you're using NuGet to go out and get all these modules to bring down and deal with adding functionality. You've got Ruby gems, you've got the Node package manager, you got things like struts. You got all these different things that are coming out on the server side that are these little pieces. If you've ever installed a Ruby application and looked at all the gems that get loaded in to be able to run that application, and then of course each of those may have subcomponents that exist within those, making sure we can keep track of that and know, hey, which ones do we actually use is really critical, because we got to make sure that we keep these updated as we're going forward with them. Because we don't control that code, we're reliant on updates coming out and being able to effectively apply those. Now, from the server side, we drop down to client side. So this is our JavaScript in the browser packages that we're using, things like jQuery, Angular, Vue.js, Bootstrap, React, right? We have all kinds of examples of front ends, basically, these view engines that we can put on our applications. And those too can have vulnerabilities, right? Any code can have vulnerabilities. So we have to keep track now of server-side issues that may be there, but also those client-side issues, because they're sending a lot of information, a lot of JavaScript down into the client to actually be executed. So if there's weaknesses there, if we assume it's output encoding our data for us to protect us from cross-site scripting, but there's a bug, well, we need to be aware of that, right? And things like Angular, where we have template injection and other issues like that, these are things that we need to stay abreast of so we can make sure that we're on top of it to patch that, or at least provide our mitigations to help protect us from it. So some of the things that we can do to help us kind of not fall victim to some of this is, first off, knowing what you have. So keeping an inventory of the high-level components that you use, whether that's the server side or the client side, making sure that you're keeping track of, hey, we're using these gems, or we use these NPM packages, or from NuGet, these are the things that we're using. The first step is knowing which items that you're using, so that way you can then try to determine if a vulnerability appears in any of those, then hopefully we know which apps are using those types of modules and we can patch those. The next thing is reducing the number of dependencies. So if you don't need it, don't use it. And left pad is actually kind of an interesting take on that because, while that was buried deep down, multiple layers and components, very nested, I don't need to go out and get a function to write left pad necessarily for my app. I could write that. It's, 11 lines of code maybe to be able to actually put that in there. I don't necessarily have to go out and use that from somebody else. But the flip side to that is if you are using it, maybe they've done extra testing, they've made sure that it's working from a more secure perspective. So a lot of these things are open source. So the good news is you can look at a lot of the code that's in there and actually evaluate it and see what it's doing. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is using those tools to help identify the known vulnerable components. So you have these different components, but how do you know if they're vulnerable? And fortunately, there are a couple tools out there. There's lots of tools actually, but a couple of free options that exist that help you identify in your different projects if your server-side components have known vulnerabilities. They're not scanning your code for vulnerabilities. What they're doing is they're taking that value or the version that you're using and they run it against a known database of vulnerabilities and says, hey, does this version have any recorded known vulnerabilities? We'll report that back to you and we'll let you know and say, hey, this has vulnerabilities in it. You might want to update to the latest version. So tools like OWASP dependency check works great for Java, for .NET. Also, they have some kind of trial versions for some other languages in Node. So if you're doing Node development, the Node security/NSP helps check for known vulnerable Node modules. In Ruby, there's the bundler-audit package that allows you to go in and it checks all your gems and it compares and says, hey, are there any known vulnerabilities here? On the client side, really the biggest one that I see and the one that I use personally is retire.js. And it's doing the same thing the server-side stuff was doing. It's just looking at the traffic, looking at what JavaScript files you're pulling in, and if they're third-party files like jQuery or Bootstrap, then it goes and checks a database for known issues. And it says, oh, you're using jQuery 1.3.1. There's known vulnerabilities with this. Better for you to upgrade to jQuery 2.1.3. So these are free tools that are listed here that are easy to implement, but give you a quick view of, hey, these are the components I have, and if there's any known vulnerabilities. So obviously, because new vulnerabilities come out all the time, you definitely want to make sure you're running these on a regular basis to validate those packages that you have. So hopefully that helps provide that foundation for what's going to happen for the rest of this presentation. Back to you, Michael.
Great, thanks so much, James. Really good presentation there. And again, any of our viewers that have any questions for James, do feel free to pop those into the question section, and we'll look to come to those a bit later. So I'm just going to close the voting on that first poll question now before we move on. So we asked which of the following best describes your role. So you've got 65% of you are security, 10% both for development and operations, and 15% other management. So just before I hand over to our second speaker then, I'll start the voting on the second poll question. So we want to know next, who in your organisation is ultimately responsible for the maintenance of third-party commercial and open source components? Is that A, development team, B, security team, C, developer that uses them, D, operations team, E, other? And I'm going to start the voting on that one now, so please do vote on that one too, and we'll come back to those results a bit later. But moving on, delighted to hand over to our next speaker now, Callum Budd. So Callum, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm here today representing Vanson Bourne. We are an independent market research agency, and I was the project manager who worked on this project, which was commissioned by Veracode. And we worked alongside Veracode to conduct some research, which we were aiming to investigate the uses of components and the security within components. So that involved what organizations were doing with their components, how they were implementing them, how were they protecting them, and how they were auditing them as well. We've only got a small subsection of the results to go through today. There are a much wider range of results that are available, Veracode produced a brilliant white paper off the back of this piece of research, so that is available if anyone has got a particular interest in this area and wants to read a little bit more. So before we dive into the results then, here's just a little bit of background around who we interviewed as a part of this research. And for the research, we interviewed 400 app developers in February and March, a little earlier this year. We interviewed in 3 different countries, in the US, the UK and Germany, across a whole different range of organisation sectors. It was open to any sector, and it was also open to a range of size of organisations as well. As I say, we've got just a very short subsection of key findings to go through, but that white paper is available with more details as well. So firstly, if we look at the methodology that was used for organisations are using for development in their organisation, and this was quite interesting. So this donut chart on the left-hand side is actually showing us that the most likely methodology being used right now within organisations is DevOps, according to our 400 app developers, closely followed by Agile, so 33% in that pink portion of that donut chart on the left. And then only a small proportion said that they're still using Waterfall, which of course is slightly outdated these days. We did have 14% in the orange section of that chart who said that they do not use a specific methodology, which could lead to a bit of a lack of skills and a gap in skills, given that they perhaps can't be an expert in each of those different areas of the development. So therefore, they may be lacking in some skills in one of those particular areas. And on the right-hand side, we've also taken a look at the average number of times per week that code is released. And it was 3 times per week on average from what we saw. And that high frequency does indicate that move towards DevOps or an agile methodology is very much in progress, and that seems to be the way that organizations are going. It also points towards the need to manage security on a very regular basis. Of course, if code and applications and components are all being updated that regularly, then security needs to be reviewed at that regular interval as well. And with that security type focus in mind, do organizations have a formal application security program in place? So on the left-hand side, we can see that it was only 71% of our app developers who said that their organization has that formal AppSec program in place. And that perhaps could be due to the speed that code is now being released, due to that constant refresh on applications, on code, and obviously those newer, more agile-focused methodologies, which perhaps is leading them to need to take shortcuts. Perhaps they're not able to keep up to date with a formal application security program. Perhaps that is just not feasible anymore with that frequency that the code is being released. And those who are not doing this are putting their organizations at severe risk. We all know the different types of breaches that are available. We just heard from James on the last set of slides around the Equifax breach, and that is one great example of where not being up to date with your security can put you at risk. And on the right-hand side here, we've got another chart which showed how familiar our respondents were with the OWASP top 10 application risks. And we found that 82% had at least some familiarity, but it was only that green portion, the 21% of our respondents, who said that they're totally familiar. And our conversations with Veracode at the very start of this project, at the Outlook, we discussed that there needs to be a huge amount of focus on OWASP. It needs to be well known within organizations. It is the standard to follow. And of course, that needs to be transpired out to our app developers. So we've had a bit of a think about security and how organizations might be protecting themselves or perhaps aren't. So if we now have a little look at how components are used within organizations. So this chart is showing us on the left-hand side that we do have 93% of organizations using commercial and or open source components. The biggest portion of that donut chart on the left is showing you that 63% use both, so they do use a combination. But what we took away from this slide was that components are required. There may be a mixture of styles of components that are being used by organisations, and of course that can vary in terms of how they're using them, how they're deploying them. It can also vary in terms of the amount of components that they've got per application. So our respondents told us that it was 73 components in each application on average, but of course it can be far higher than that as well. And that vast number of components per application does make it difficult to track security, and it does make it very difficult to make sure that everything is up to date all at that same time. And on the right-hand side here, we asked our respondents why they're leveraging third-party commercial and or open source components. And we actually saw some really positive outcomes here. 53% said it was the best practice, but we also had 51% who said that it enables them to work faster, and 47% said that it enables them to do advanced functions that they can't do themselves, which goes to show that there is that value to be derived from using components within organisations. And with that in mind, organisations are unlikely to return to that more traditional methodology. They're likely to move more towards that DevOps methodology as they're moving forwards. So what do our app developers think the ideal component structure is then? In general, it is a combination. So 66% said that it was desirable to have both open source and commercial components in their code within their organisation, which goes to show that at least some degree of commercial components is required, and components are widely needed. So what are the key priorities when adopting a new open source or third-party commercial component? This was a really fascinating set of results here actually. 62% that said that functionality was a likely consideration when adopting one of those components. 48% said performance, and 44% said cost. So that did make up our top three, our three most likely considerations. But 42% said that it was known security vulnerabilities. And of course, from our side, from our conversations with Veracode, we know that this should be a much higher priority. This should be up there with functionality right at the top there, because of course organisations who are not keeping that focus on security vulnerabilities are very much likely to be leaving themselves at risk. We also looked at when components are updated within organisations. And for this chart here, this represents a question which was a multi-choice question. So that means that our respondents could select any number of these different scenarios that are listed here on this chart. And what we found was 52% said that they do update their components when a new security vulnerability is announced. And for us, we thought that that should be the bare minimum, really. Everyone should be updating their components when a new security vulnerability is announced. But this particular chart had loads of interesting results. Again, it was only 42% who said that they do this when they need new functionality or a bug patch. So again, it's more when it's forced upon them. And again, that should probably be a bare minimum. 27% said that it was controlled by corporate policy, and 18% said that it was when they were told to, which are not really good reasons to be doing this. More people should be doing it for every release, and including for major releases as well. So this was a really fascinating set of stats that we had here. So do organisations keep on top of their inventory? This was really interesting, this slide here. So we had 53% of our respondents saying that they keep an inventory of all of their components. Again, this is one area where we felt that organisations should be doing more. This should be closer to that 100% mark, and anyone who is not doing that is one of those organisations who are leaving themselves at risk. When organisations aren't keeping that very up-to-date inventory, they may not have the right inventory in place. There may be duplication of components, And of course, alongside that, there are going to be inefficiencies in terms of looking for components, looking for code, and organizations are likely to be increasing their costs all this time that they're adding these inefficiencies onto themselves. And that's a very brief overview of the results that we found in that data that we conducted with Veracode. If anyone has any questions, then feel free to fire them our way. And I'll pass back to you, Michael.
Great, thanks so much, Callum. Again, a really great presentation there. And like Callum said, any questions that our viewers have, do put those into the questions section, and we'll have a look at those later for you. So before we move on, then I'm going to stop the voting on that second poll question. So we asked, who in your organisation is ultimately responsible for the maintenance of third-party commercial and open source components? Top answer for that was 33% development team. We had 16% tie of security team and operations team, 27% said other, and 5% said the developer that uses them. Okay, moving on then, I'll start the voting now on the third and final poll question. So we want to know next, does your development team leverage open source libraries and components when building applications? A, all of the time. B, most of the time and always for most critical apps. C, frequently but not on a regular basis. D, sometimes. E, rarely or never. And I'm going to open the voting on that one, so do vote on that one too, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But moving on, delighted to introduce our third speaker, Mark Curtis. So Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Before I get going, actually, just wanted to say how nice it is to hear people talk about OWASP. I was the guy who founded that project back in 2002, and when you start a project like that without a sort of goal, you have no clue the impact it's going to have. And to hear different speakers talking about tools and advice and guidance and what an impact that has, it's super nice to hear. So just wanted to say that. What I was just going to do is sort of take a few slides from a few different presentations that I've done and just walk through the landscape, really. So a lot of people may have heard of Mark Andreessen. He was the guy who created Netscape. Itself was an open source project. He's now a venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz. And he has a phrase that software is eating the world. And he talks about how, these days everyone is a technology company, whether you're a bank or a car sharing business or whatever. But really, when I think about that, I think about it slightly differently. The impact of open source is absolutely huge. So, when Obama was still the president, 20% of the U.S. he wrote an executive order, 20% of the U.S. code must be open source. And so we've now seen intelligence agencies, National Administration, NASA, all open source significant, parts of their code base. But really, when I think about software eating the world, I think about the rise of companies that are iconic brands that have been created on the back of open source. Not necessarily open source producers, but people that have produced code to further their business. So brands like Facebook, open source is core to Facebook. So the same with Google, Chromium, Android. We think about things like LinkedIn, it's Kafka. Netflix, one of the disrupting the movie and digital media businesses are all fundamentally based on open source. So really, instead of software eating the world, one way to think about it is that it's open source code that's eating the world. And we've seen that in the massive rise of libraries. So I refer to them as libraries, not components. And those libraries, the graph here is sort of a year or so old, but really just showed the amount of libraries that are out there. If you look at, this is a combined view of JavaScript, Python, Ruby, and Java, and you can see, way over 500,000 libraries. That's not 500,000 versions. That's 500,000 unique libraries that were out there. You could slice and dice that by different kind of means as well. So, if you looked at the total number of libraries, as I said, sort of over 650,000 at the time. I think it's something close to about 800,000 right now. We'll kind of get there in a second. If you think about that in terms of lines of code, it's $1.5 billion lines of code at the time. Just unimaginable, right? You can't deal with this scale in kind of human terms. And there's also another bunch of fundamental trends that are affecting this. So it used to be the case that the average Java library would release about 4 times a year. In 2016, the average Java library was releasing about 6 times a year. We, on the back of the SourceClear platform, and SourceClear was recently acquired by Veracode, so if you're kind of confused by those two things, I'm now part of Veracode. But these trends are very important. So instead of us having 4 releases a year and 4 updates, now we're seeing 6 updates. In the JavaScript world, it's even faster. And then there's also a whole set of interesting other data which kind of points to other things. So we've done some studies behind the scenes, and we've seen that Java libraries tend to be released during the working week. JavaScript libraries tend to be released on a Monday. You could hypothesize that that's because most JavaScript libraries are written over the weekend. So there's a lot of interesting trends and interesting shifts that we're seeing underneath the hood in this marketplace. What we had our data scientist, Dr. Wallace, do was basically took a look and put all of these things together into a trend line. And it's fuzzy math, right? So it's kind of like it's unlikely to be linear, and you could certainly poke holes in this from an academic basis, but it's directionally correct. And what that really tells us is in a decade, we are likely to have about 500 million libraries. And there's a lot of fundamental technology trends that are making that true. So if we think about things like Git allows us to take one copy of a piece of code and basically create another copy. And all of a sudden, we have 2 libraries. It's kind of like genetic modification is happening. And that has significant effects on security. If we take one vulnerable library and we copy it, we now have 2 vulnerable libraries. Then 2 people take 2 copies of those libraries, we have 4 vulnerable libraries, etc. So we are really just at the beginning point of this becoming a problem. And so what we've seen in what started with Heartbleed, what then continued with Shellshock, what we've seen out with Apache Struts really is just the new normal in terms of this. And of course, the fundamental trend that happens is that the bad guys have figured out that reusable libraries means reusable vulnerabilities. And that's the fundamental piece of it, where if we wind back to the 90s, viruses and worms took off because someone could write one virus and one worm, which would then work on everyone's Windows machines, the 400 million Windows machines that were connected to the internet. We have the same problem, so we've seen an inverse flip on the attack surface. The economics of attacking, 10 million developers is significantly better than attacking one individual web app. If I can, and of course with the trends of DevOps, where the developers now have all the power to push that code right into the very heart of business, we now have, a set of conditions where essentially the developers are being treated like drug mules. They are, being the conduits for pushing bad code into good apps, and so that fundamental kind of economics has changed. The way I think most people kind of understand the way that this code gets consumed is it's like building a cocktail. You first choose your framework, so I'm going to use Struts, or I'm going to use Spring, or I'm going to use React, whatever I choose. I then write a set of custom code. I realize that the thing I'm trying to solve is hard. I then go look and find I want to choose an open source library because someone else has solved it before me. And all of a sudden, the end result is that the open source code, i.e. code that I didn't write, the vast majority of it is someone else's. There is a very large network manufacturer, traditional kind of firm in some ways, although an iconic brand. Over 3/4 of the code in their product was not created by them. And we have a lot of the cool kid startups in San Francisco. 95 to 98% of the code in their applications, these are things that probably most of you are using day by day, was not created by them. And so in this world, we have to think about security differently. In the old world, we would think about what is the code that my people are creating. So I would think about threat models, I would think about static analysis, I would think about educating the developers. None of those things have an effect on code that someone else writes. And so in this new world, we have to think about 4 fundamental questions. The first one is, what do I have? So what open source am I actually using? Turns out it's a really easy question to ask, but actually a very complex one to answer. The second one is, where did it come from? Should I trust it? The third one is, what does it do? And the fourth one is, what's its quality in terms of things like vulnerabilities? And so if we think about some of these challenges that we're faced with, open source distribution is fundamentally changing. Developers consume open source through central repositories, not the place where the code is created, it's distribution places, npm.js, Maven Central, etc. But none of those places provide security controls themselves. So if you think about when you download a mobile app from the Apple App Store or from Google Play, they have a set of technology behind that which is making sure that people don't stage malware that then gets distributed. None of the distribution systems do that, or they don't do it in an effective way. They're kind of just touching a few things, and we kind of got a matrix to kind of show you that next. So, and then of course, many of the security decisions are completely taken out of the decision from the developers themselves. So when you run a package manager, when you run npm install or yarn install now, because no one uses JavaScript developers just all shifted to kind of yarn from the old school npm, or whether you run Gradle or Maven if you're still kind of in the old school of Java dev, there's a lot of decisions that are made by the package managers. They make the decision around which package to use, where to pull it from, and which version resolves the dependency. And each of those decisions have significant security implications. Whether I'm pulling a local version which may meet the requirements but is insecure is a decision which is made by the package manager. So many of these security decisions are outside of the control. I think the first presenter talked about NPM and LeftPad and made a great point, but you cannot not use LeftPad. You do not have a choice. It is used. The project will not compile without it, and that's what they found with Express with using that. So even if the library is not used, your application may not compile because it's one of these transitive dependencies. So vast amounts of complexity behind the scenes in open source that have significant impacts on security. We have a lot of data behind the SourceClear platform because we have all of these libraries, the binaries, the source, etc., staged in a big data system. And it's pretty fascinating to look at actually some of those trends. So in a Java world, for every one library that the developer chooses to use, so if you drop something into your POM file, 4 more libraries will get used when you run, Maven clean compile or whatever your choice at the command line is. In the JavaScript world, Node or Yarn, it actually turns out to be even more. So Node, for instance, allows you to have multiple versions of the same library. Yarn has solved that problem where most people are moving towards it. But it's 10 libraries for every one. And so if you want to go and analyze the code for vote.gov, which was the thing to register for the US voting system, 19 libraries were used, 600 libraries in the final product. And the bad guys, of course, have figured this out, right? So they're not going to hide vulnerable stuff in the 19 that's easy to go find. And that first generation and some of those very simplistic tools will kind of, just go look at that first level of things. But that's why this analysis has to happen at the build. It's the only time when you actually know what you have. And if you go back to those 4 things you have to know, it's like, what do I have? Where did it come from? What does it do? And what's its quality? So pretty significant kind of implications of doing that, which informs where you have to go do your analysis and all of those things. We spoke about this in kind of the direct and indirect dependencies, and of course that translates into where the vulnerabilities are. What we're seeing is a macro trend where libraries themselves are being further split into smaller and smaller pieces. So that great example of LeftPad, I think it was 11 lines of code to write a padding function. That was the size of the library. It used to be the case where we would have large libraries that would do lots of things. So the data problem is getting larger and larger. And then, going back to the registries, and this is, a little bit out of date now because we'll talk about kind of NPM, but none of the registries verify code for malware. And by that, I mean in an automated way. If someone goes and reports something, they'll go take a look. But I can tell you there's been many cases reported that have been ignored by them, and they've just sat on it for a long, long time. And there has been malware in all of the major platforms. In Python last year, someone was pushing Python libraries that was specifically targeting big data systems. It was reported first by the Polish CERT, and they were specifically targeting data scientists who typically use Python to write their front ends. So highly targeted, attacks. NPM, we've seen malware pushed in NPM that was reading the environment variables when you ran npm install. So it would read the environment variables in the hope that you had an SSH key or an AWS key, and then it would go post it back home. And of course, when you run the build, it runs with privileges, and so you have this interesting kind of set of dynamics. We know that exactly that same malware is being pushed into Maven Central and other places as well, and we have evidence of that. It's not a problem of any one particular language or technology, but it's the distribution mechanism. And then, of course, the distribution is changing in languages like Go. So instead of even using a central resource, it goes straight back to the master in the Git repo. So now we've got millions of distribution points as well. So the problem's kind of changing there. What traditionally people thought about was the problem was around looking at CVEs and public vulnerabilities. But of course, developers have also embraced DevOps. And so, in this day and age, no one goes back really and gets a CVE number and waits 6 weeks for MITRE to go issue a number. The vast majority of the vulnerabilities simply aren't published into those public databases. We can kind of talk about that in a second. And so all of these conditions lead us to what we fundamentally believe is that we're in a place where we are going to start to see server-side ransomware. This isn't just about individual vulnerabilities. And I presented with John Viega at the ApacheCon where we backdoored Java, Apache struts, and Spring applications. And all we needed to do was to get a single developer to use our library. We've done the same for NPM, and I believe we can do all the same for all of the major languages. And so the kind of attack vector goes, you get someone to install your library, you make it look attractive. So you make, maybe a special super-duper logging library or crash analytics or whatever the problem that everyone's going to solve. And I get you to use it once. Once you use it, I then am in the heart of your application. I can go through and I can look and figure out where your database connectivity is. I can figure out all sorts of things. I can go encrypt the data. I can go ransomware your customers. And when we did it for the first time at ApacheCon, people were shocked and thought it was smokes and mirrors. But it's real, and we haven't seen it in the wild. At least not public cases of it, but it is absolutely coming. And so we are going to see open source as that frog mule, not only for people for vulnerabilities to exploit individual cases, but for this stuff to go spread and ransomware kicking in. The first generation of the tools, like I mentioned, kind of basically just grepped through those initial build files, and some of those free tools do that. That second generation of tools, though, and kind of like the tool that SourceClear built, which is acquired by Veracode, we realized fairly early on that there was another significant problem in this open source world. That problem was that it turns out that 9 times out of 10, when you're using a vulnerable piece of open source, you're actually not using the vulnerable code within it. So the example is I have 10 libraries, but I'm only actually vulnerable once. And because I'm only using the vulnerable code, they're all included. So it might be like leftpad may be included in my final product, but there's no trace, there's no method call to that. And so that's very important in the DevOps world, and particularly important from a security perspective. To be honest, kind of security's not had a great reputation for generating lots of noise and lots of false positives in the past. And we're now living in a world of DevOps where automation is key and we have to be accurate. And so, today we have to go basically build a call graph, a way to trace through the code. We have to have the information around where the actual vulnerable part of the vulnerable open source library is, and we have to use control flow analysis to go track that. And again, back to the CVE system, they tend to be high-level descriptions, not down to where the problem is in the code. The other thing that's kind of interesting to look at as well is that if you look at the amount of vulnerabilities that are public out there today, but we look at the amount of libraries, we did a study where we looked at some of the code commits where we find all of these non-public vulnerabilities and then extrapolated it back out to the millions of libraries that we have today. We estimate that instead of the couple of thousands of problems, there are probably about 250,000 vulnerabilities that are out there in those systems. And some of those can be a choice of things. So the word chart is how we think about these vulnerabilities. They could be inherited vulnerabilities, maybe that one library is using another that has a vulnerability. It could be a disclosed vulnerability. It could be an embedded vulnerability. People now are embedding one library into another and not telling you. So you go to systems like conjars and webjars and things. Can be a similar thing. So it's where people have cut and pasted code. One of our researchers, Vanessa here, looked at a vulnerability that was in a gem, and then she looked at the code pattern. She looked across the code of all the rest of the gems and found 250 other libraries that had exactly the same problem, using the same thing. We actually have reported a problem to AWS last year in one of their libraries that was doing contract first development as well. We've seen cases where the same vulnerability has been reintroduced in code. We released a big vulnerability in Spring Social last year where the issue had actually been fixed but was back and reintroduced back into a later code base, and it allowed you to completely bypass authentication. It was used in several financial services companies. So we're seeing vast amounts of these types of issues that are out there. So hopefully it just gives you a kind of flavor of where we are. And with that, I will hand back to Michael.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mark. A really great presentation there. Okay, so just before we move on to the last section of the webinar, we'll just go over the results of that third poll question. So we asked, does your development team leverage open source libraries and components when building applications? 29% was the top answer, which was all the time. 23% was for frequently but not on a regular basis and sometimes. 17% rarely or never, and just 5% said most of the time and always for most critical apps. Okay, we've got a few minutes left then, so we will look to tackle a few questions. James, let's come to you. A couple of questions relating to, I think, what you mentioned in your presentation with regards to some of the tools that you suggested. So one of you wants to know if you could summarise what you think the best practices are for implementing some of the tools that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it just depends on what you have the capability of doing within your organization. Obviously, if we can automate the use of those tools, it's going to be a lot better, right? So if I can automate using dependency check, put it in my DevOps, put it in my continuous integration, whatever we're doing, put that in there so that way it's always going through and automatically checking and providing those results, and then being able to determine how we can automate grabbing that out and moving forward with it. That's not as easy to do with like Retire.js for the client side scripts. One of the reasons for that being there's not a lot of tools that I've seen, at least, that on the server side will actually check for the client side script stuff. So a lot of times we see solutions that'll say, hey, we'll identify your third-party components and known vulnerabilities to them, but oftentimes they don't include the JavaScript side. So things like Retire.js, I use it in Burp Suite. So when I run my web proxy, I use it so that way anytime I'm testing, it automatically pops up and alerts me to any issues that it identifies. But you can also use it as a browser plugin, so Firefox, Chrome. You can do a plugin with it. So that way if you have QA analysts that are just testing, one of the things they can keep an eye out for is as they're testing, hey, did we spot any known vulnerable components? As it was stated later on in the presentation, these are kind of that higher level. It's not getting deep down into what these components then reference from other components to see if those components are vulnerable, but it does give you that kind of quick hit, high level view of what type of vulnerabilities may exist for you.
Sure, great, thanks for that, James. Thanks for that answers the question for our viewer there. Callum, let's come to you with a question. Maybe you can sort of draw from some of the findings from the report. The viewer wants to know, are you seeing any correlation between the adoption rate of DevOps within organizations and their reporting and management of third-party and open source components?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So when we had a look at the data and we had a look at those who are using DevOps compared to those who aren't, or compared to the general total, we did find that those using DevOps are more likely to be using a combination of commercial and open source components. So off the top of my head, that was 70% of those using DevOps were using components as well, compared to just 63% of those in total. And on average, they actually do use more third-party commercial and open source components in their applications as well, on average. So that did come across in the research. It'd be interesting to hear if that's what everyone else is seeing in the market, but certainly from the research, that did tend to be the trend that was coming out.
Sure, okay, great, thanks, Callum. Mark, let's come to you. Keen to actually touch on that third poll question, actually, if you wouldn't mind sharing a few thoughts. So we asked again, does your development team leverage open source libraries and components when building applications? The top answer, 29%, was all of the time. Are you surprised by that figure, or was that what you would expect to see?
Yeah, no, not at all. So I am yet to meet any company that does not use open source. I sometimes talk to some pointy head bosses who will say, oh, we don't use that here, and then their engineering people will kind of like just raise their eyebrows. It is now the new norm. Like, I don't believe that there's anyone that is not consuming it, and of course that drive, you basically It's a choice of innovation. You have to move fast and add value. So there is no point in building things that everyone else is building. You want to build differences, and that open source is the business model that allows you to go do that. So not surprised by that at all, and we're only going to see it better. And again, I think the message to the audience is it's not that open source is scary in any sense. It is amazing. It's a brilliant ecosystem, wonderful technology, brilliant business model. You just meet fantastic people behind it. But there is care and attention that needs to be taken. It's not a panacea. Without thinking about some of those things, it will give you all of those advantages. And that's I think the place we're at today is people are understanding that and are figuring out what the process and tooling is needed to carry on embracing open source and carry on building amazing technology.
Sure. No, I mean, interesting. Obviously, you mentioned there that it's becoming such a commonplace thing. Just sort of leading on to another question with you, Mark, and maybe we'll get some thoughts from James on it as well. But let's start with you. Do you think then there is enough awareness around the possible risks, security risks, with open source components at the moment, considering how kind of popular and used they are now?
I mean, absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, not. People still, don't understand what the problem is and don't understand what the ramifications are. So again, kind of when we do this ransomware demo, people are like, hey, that's not real, and it's absolutely real. It's very easy. I think the challenge is that the security industry historically has been sort of Chicken Little, that the world's falling down, and I think people are a little skeptical. But all of the conditions are there in the same way that we saw viruses and worms propagate. DevOps has given the developers all the power to put things into the software supply chain. We have bad guys with attacking the upstream with mass distribution downstream. When it happens, I don't think anyone should be surprised.
Okay, and then James, maybe just a few thoughts from you. I mean, do you agree with that? What have you seen in terms of general awareness about this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree exactly what Mark was saying. There's still a lot of lack of awareness around it, but I think a lot of that stems from the fact that it's really difficult to even understand or determine, hey, is this component safe? Is it not safe? I mean, people go out, they need to build stuff. What do? You go online, you Google it, and you say, hey, I need to be able to do X. And, the forums out there, everybody says, oh, go out and grab this package and do this, right? I need to do bcrypt for my password storage. Go grab the bcrypt package. Well, if you go look in NPM, there's, probably 50 different bcrypt packages. How do you know which one? And, I think, like we said, there's a lot of push, that we've been kind of this sky is falling thing that, even developers that have had some access into security, still look back at it and say, look, I picked this one, I picked that one. Either way, I'm going to be wrong. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick one and go forward. And, as we were sitting here going through the presentation, I was kind of thinking about that. It was a question I was going to send out later on, actually, on Twitter, asking, a lot of times we expect our application security groups or our security groups to be able to, approve the package that you're using. But, that begs the question of how do they know which packages are safe and which ones aren't safe without running it through, some sort of static analysis or doing a code review or anything like that. So I think that leads a lot to it as well, is that because there's no clear way to determine, this isn't like installing an Android app where it pops up and says, hey, I use these 50 components and I touch these different things. It's, I'm just going to load a gem in, or I'm going to load a new module in, and it'll just work. And it doesn't tell me what it touches or what it does. It just does what I need it to do, and that's all that matters. And with as fast as we're trying to create apps, that's all that really matters in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah, I mean to add to that, this sort of old school approach is, hey, I'm going to create a list of things that are approved to use. It simply doesn't work in today's environment, and we know that. We're deployed at massive companies, like say tech companies. We've kind of gone through this experience. If that happens, the developers will bypass the security. Like they can go choose their own tools, they can spin them up online, they can bypass it. We're now moving at a world where we have one customer that scans and builds 8,000 times a day, right, and deploys 300 times a day. So So, if we're moving at the speed of DevOps, security has to work at the speed of DevOps, and that requires automation. And so these older kind of ways of doing like final release processes, humans getting in the way, simply doesn't work now. The good news is the technology that's getting advanced to go do it, and we can embrace some of that. So solutions are there, but definitely it's a new way of thinking for sure.
Sure. Okay. Maybe just one last sort of point to finish off. We've got a couple of minutes left. Just keen to get maybe one thought from each speaker in terms of what they think the future, or maybe the next 12 months, is going to have in store with regards to this area. Callum, was there anything that you could take away from the research findings that you think gives an indication of anything in particular that you think we're going to see over the next year?
I guess the results that we saw from the research indicating that trend of organisations moving towards more modern-looking methodology. So we saw that shift towards DevOps is happening. That does seem to be the way that organisations are going. And alongside that, we would expect organisations to be evolving and developing the way that they secure their components and the way that they add security to their particular methodologies within their organisation. So we think that there should and probably will likely be big changes in the way that security is integrated into the methodologies coming in the next sort of 12 months or so.
Okay, sure. James, anything at all you'd like to just add in there quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to see, as we see more of these third-party components and package managers and those type of things coming out, is more ways to automate the actual ability to update those packages for us, rather than having to push it back and say, hey, you've got this, instead finding ways to do that. And I know that's complex, right? Because you get a patch to a package and it breaks your app. How do you get around that? But if we can start building more towards that capability of being able to update those packages kind of behind the scenes without interaction, that's going to make it a lot easier, because now we don't have to worry as much about raising all that awareness to developers of, hey, use this gem or use this package, don't use this package. It's, look, we put them in there and we'll build systems that'll actually manage those for us behind the scenes. Hopefully we can get there.
Okay, great. And Mark, any last remark from you at all?
Well, you teed me up perfectly, because we've actually just released that feature, and I know that you didn't know it, but we actually go automatically update the PR, and we test it with a call graph to make sure the project's not going to broken. So we're there. We are at the page of having the equivalent of Windows Update now. So I don't want to turn it into a product pitch, but we are there, which is great. The thing I would say is that I think we're ultimately kind of living in a world of DevOps, and that is changing everything. So it's changing. Instead of us being prescriptive with security, we have to be consultative. We have to make sure that security doesn't get in the way, it doesn't slow things down, and we have to carry on moving at those speeds. So all of the choices that we make have to be governed by making sure that it is security that will work in the new world that we're moving into. And some of that is uncomfortable for people because it's not the way that we've done things before. But we have to take that on board. And then, so the second thing I'll say is that it's an amazing opportunity because we can rethink security now. So instead of us having to try and do more and more of what we've done before, and let's face it hasn't worked for the last 20 years, we can now start applying, some of this modern new technology, machine learning, big data systems, and we now have a new control point, which is CI. So we now are able to kind of, instead of us living in this distributed world, we can now make sure we check things before they get deployed. So for me, I'm very optimistic about the future. I think this is a fantastic time, but there's definitely some things that are different that we're all going to have to learn to embrace.
Okay, great. Well, that's pretty much all the time we've got then, so we're going to have to look to wrap things up there. So a big thank you to Veracode for sponsoring this session, and obviously a big thank you to James, Callum and Mark for joining us as well. For details on upcoming webinars, please do see our website. Our next session is actually the 26th of June, and we're going to be looking at post-GDPR, is it too late to comply? So we look forward to you joining us for that if you can. Please don't forget there is a recording of this webinar that will be available on our website shortly. You can also rate the webinar, you can tell us what you liked and let us know anything you'd like to hear from us in the future. Without further ado, I'll say one last thank you to you all for joining us, and we will end the session there.